Chapter 2. I thought for a moment there that Wayne was going to read his next article. He has 5 or 6 more pages to go. Listen, I would like to pick up on something that George started to talk about, is how the governor organized his government. Because I think, you know, we've heard a lot from, in the debates in the presidential race and everything this year about change, certainly, and about trying different approaches. But we've also heard, and I think very eloquently from Senator Obama, that he can't do it alone. I think, unfortunately, the governor thought when he got elected, he would just move across the street, his entire office, that he was very comfortable with, and they could do it alone. And they could make all this change. And that's just not the way I think state government, city government, or the federal government works best. In the governor's first year, you could make the case that it didn't work at all. So 25% of his term has gone by. He doesn't have, Wayne could dispute this, but he doesn't really have the big feathers in his cap to show for it. He got bogged down for whatever reason, whether it's a scandal or not a scandal. He walked right into that thing called Troop Brigade. His people created it. Why? Because they all worked for Eliot Spitzer. They're all afraid of Eliot Spitzer. They've never stood up and argued with Eliot Spitzer. If they have, it's a big secret. But the point is, look at, I worked for Governor Carey. He reached out, he brought in a chief of staff from Massachusetts. He brought in Peter Goldmark to be budget director. He'd never worked with those people before. He took Bob Morgado, who he found in a staff position in the executive chamber, made him deputy secretary and director of state operations. He kept the second in command of the budget division, who'd been around for 20 or 25 years. He had a mix of commissioners from in government, out of government, private sector, public service, in various walks of life, philanthropy. Mike Bloomberg set up his government the same way. If you just look at the deputy mayors that Mike put around him, you'll see that he had one person who came from his company that he had trusted implicitly for about 7 or 8 years with all of his business dealings and all of his endeavors. He brought in Dr. Roth from the private sector to work on economic development. He had Mark Shaw, who had a long career in government, at the MTA and in state and city government. He kept Mark Page in the budget division and made him budget director because he knew where the numbers were and where the money was. And he brought in Dennis Walcott from Queens to be a deputy mayor, Karen Robles-Roman to be his counsel and deputy mayor, and Peter Madonia, who didn't have the title deputy mayor, but as chief of staff functioned almost like a deputy mayor, who had experience in the Koch administration and in the fire department. He had a mix of people who understood civil service, politics, government, private sector, not-for-profits. These are the things that make the city run. And I would just say that I don't think Governor Spitzer had that model. His model was, okay, pack the boxes and move across the street, now we're going to be governor. And I don't think that served him well at all.
I don't, just on the point about yesterday's election, I don't know if it was more of a referendum on Spitzer, more a referendum on the Senate Republicans. I mean, Spitzer's still remains pretty unpopular in the polls. I think more people want to see a new governor than want to re-elect him at this point. But I think that the Senate Republicans are more deeply unpopular, and I think that it was just a recognition among voters that keeping the Senate Republicans in power is ultimately not going to change things in state government. It's ultimately not going to improve the situation with property taxes and other issues. But I think that I guess the basic problem with Spitzer's first year is that he didn't appreciate the subtleties of governing. He had no respect for it. He had no recognition for it. I think coming from his 8-year tenure as Attorney General, I think he just saw things as in black and white terms. good guys versus bad guys, and in Albany it's much more complicated in that it's much more difficult to portray yourself as the good guy, and things are much more in shades of gray. And I think he didn't feel like it was necessary to pay proper respect to the legislative prerogatives. I don't think he thought it was necessary to give them credit or work with them on achieving deals. You know, when they were negotiating the budget, his advisors urged him, said that you have to let them take credit for things. You have to orchestrate some victories so they can come home to their constituents and say, look, this is what I've done. And Spitzer dismissed that and said that it was completely unnecessary. And I think that it led to so much bad blood with the lawmakers that in so many fights that he lost his ability to communicate with the voters. And he thought that just by standing on principle, and it would be enough, that if he had the people behind him and he stood on principle, he could get the legislature to do things. But I think that he realized that it's not enough, that you have to build coalitions, you have to work with people, you have to show respect for people. And I think that's one of the lessons he's learned, and now coming into this second year, I think he's still basically the same Spitzer. I still think he feels that he's smarter than everybody else. I still think he believes that he is a steamroller. But I don't think he's going to be saying that anymore. I think he's more cautious, more practical, at least his advisors are, and I think he's just as competitive as he was his first year, but I think he's a smarter politician now.
Oh, great. You know, I talked with all of you yesterday, and some of the things you wanted to touch upon. And as far as the missteps that he made the first year, Wayne, you talked about Troopergate. You don't think it's as big of a deal as it's been made out to be, but you cite the abuse. You thought it was an abuse of power over his fight to pick the controller. Could you talk about that? And Jacob, could you talk about then the driver's license issue and the impact of that?
Look, we have a state constitution. I assume the governor read it. And the controller is supposed to be an independent public official. No governor, in my memory, has ever tried to stack that deck. And he was clearly abusing his power. I mean, Pete Granis, I wrote a story about this. Pete Granis was a member of the assembly who Spitzer would have had a very hard time opposing, and he was a candidate for state controller. And the juxtaposition of timing in the story that I wrote, I can't remember the details of it, but it was literally the morning that Pete Granis appeared before the committee that included the 3 former controllers that was supposedly making selections of finalists for the controller position. The very morning that he appeared, Pete Granis goes back to his office, and the governor's secretary, Rich Baum, is on the line and offers him a job in the administration to try to take him out of the action.